In this lecture, we're going to go over break-even point. The break-even point is the point where you make no money, but you don't lose any money. So you're breaking even at zero. There's a lot of different equations to get to this point, and we'll take a look at each of those now. The first thing we need to understand with a break-even analysis is our contribution margin. The contribution margin is your sales minus your variable costs. Therefore, we can look at a contribution margin income statement by taking our sales, subtracting our variable costs to get to our contribution margin. Then we subtract our fixed cost, which will give us our income from operations. You can look at this in total and on a per unit basis to answer various decision-making questions. The first equation we're going to look at is our contribution margin ratio. This is our contribution margin divided by our sales, and it shows us the percentage that each sales dollar is available for us to cover our fixed cost and provide income from our operations. Our contribution margin ratio is used for our break-even point to find our break-even in dollars. So I want you to remember ratio equals dollars. So let's take a look at the contribution margin ratio. Again, your contribution format income statement shows sales minus variable cost equals contribution margin minus those fixed costs to equal your income. Therefore, if I wanted to find my contribution margin ratio, I take my contribution margin and divide that by sales. In this case, that would be 400,000 divided by a million, giving me 40%. I can do this in total, or I can do this on a per unit basis. I know that on a per unit basis, my contribution margin is $8 in this example. My sales are $20 per unit. So again, this still gives me that 40% contribution margin ratio. Now, what do I do with this ratio? First, I can find out what change in income am I going to have based on a change in sales dollars. For example, if we take that $80,000, if we add $80,000 in sales, add an additional 4,000 units, what will our increase in net income be? Because I know my contribution ratio is 40%, I can take that change in sales dollars, which is 80,000, and times it by my contribution margin ratio to give me my increase in income. So $80,000 change in sales times my 40% equals that $32,000. And that will be my increase in my net income. I can also look at this on a per unit basis because I know my contribution margin per unit is $8. Therefore, if I sell 4,000 units, I'm going to make $8 per unit more. So 8 times 4,000 units is also $32,000. We can confirm this increase in income by performing our income statement. If we want to, we can take a look and increase our sales by that additional 4,000 units, which will increase our sales amount. We would have to also increase our variable expenses because those do change in proportion to the level of activity. You'll notice our contribution margin per unit would not change, but in total it would increase. Our fixed costs are going to remain the same, and our income from operations will then again increase by $32,000. So this is a good way to just double check yourself if you want to and make sure your contribution margin ratio is accurate. Now, we did talk about our unit contribution margin, but let's take a closer look at it. Again, our unit contribution margin is our sales per unit minus our variable cost per unit. So in this case, again, our selling price was $20, our variable cost was $12, and therefore our contribution margin per unit is $8. If we know how many additional units we're going to sell, we can use that contribution margin per unit to see what our change in income is going to be. When we look at our break-even analysis, we would use our contribution margin per unit to determine how many units we would need to break even. Now that we kind of understand our contribution margin and our contribution margin ratio, as well as our contribution margin per unit, we can take a closer look at our break-even point. Our break-even point is the level at operations where our company's revenue equals their expenses. Therefore, our income would be zero. Our sales minus variable expenses minus our fixed expenses would equal zero. Looking at this graph, you can see at our break-even point, anything below break-even would operate a loss. Anything above our break-even is our profit. And our break-even point is going to be where our total costs intersect with our total revenue. This graph also shows you a couple of other points. We'll have our fixed cost line. Remember, those fixed costs remain the same. We also show our margin of safety. Your margin of safety is the point above your break-even point, and we'll take a closer look at that in a few minutes. In order to find break-even point, our fixed costs have to be covered by our contribution margin. Therefore, when we want to look at our break-even in sales units, we would take our fixed cost and divide that by our unit contribution margin. Remember, if we want to find our units to break even, we would use our unit contribution margin. Units equal units. Looking at this example, we can see that we would take our fixed costs, which are $90,000, divide that by our unit contribution margin to get 9,000 units. To verify this, let's look at our sales at 9,000 units, subtract out our variable cost to get our contribution margin, which will equal that same $90,000, subtract out our fixed costs, and you will see our income is zero, meaning we just broke even. Let's take a look at our break-even in sales dollars. To get our break-even in sales dollars, we would take our fixed cost and divide that by our contribution margin ratio. Remember, dollars equal ratio. Let's take a quick look at this. So our unit contribution we figured out was $10 per unit. To get to a contribution margin ratio, we could take our unit contribution margin and divide by our selling price. This is equal to 40%. Therefore, if we want our break-even sales dollars, we take our fixed cost, divide that by our 40%, which we get to $225. This would be how much in sales we need to make to break even. But typically, people don't want to break even. They want to hit a profit. So what we want to find out is what our target profit is. We can look at this in sales units and in sales dollars. This is the same equation as your break-even equations, except now we're adding on that target profit to our fixed costs. We can do this again in units or by dollars. Units we have to divide by our unit contribution margin. Dollars we divide by our ratio. Let's take a quick look at this example. For example, our fixed costs are $200,000. We want to make sure we have a profit of $100,000. The first thing we need to do is find that unit contribution margin and that contribution margin ratio. Our unit contribution margin is 30. Therefore, if I take 30 divided by my 75, I would get a contribution margin ratio of 40%. Now let's look at the equations. We take our fixed cost plus our target profit and divide by our unit contribution margin, and that would show us that we need to sell 10,000 units in order to make a target profit of $100,000. In sales dollars, we would take that fixed cost plus our target profit and divide by our ratio. That shows us that we need to have sales dollars of $750,000 in order to reach that target profit of $100,000. You can perform your income statement to verify this if you would like. Another equation we use is the margin of safety. Your margin of safety is basically your cushion you have over your break-even point. So your margin of safety in dollars is sales minus your break even at sales dollars. Your margin of safety in units would be sales minus your sales at break even point over that unit selling price. So we use these equations to show us how much over our break even we actually are. If you think back to that graph that we showed earlier, again, this is your point after your break even. Let's take a look at an example of margin of safety. So if our sales are $250,000, our break-even point is $200,000, that means our margin of safety in dollars is $50,000. Our margin of safety in units would be 2,000 units. All I do is take that margin of safety and divide that by my selling price.